A president, now a prisoner. Nicolás Maduro handcuffed in blackout goggles and protective headphones, robbed of his country and his senses. Hours later, he and wife Celia Flores arrived in New York, escorted off the plane by dozens of federal agents. A change of outfit and a change of scenery. Maduro's first steps on American soil, surrounded but appearing relatively calm. The DEA showing off their catch, 2 thumbs up in handcuffs. A defiant pose from the embattled Venezuelan leader. From there, he was taken to the Drug Enforcement Administration's offices, marched in front of the cameras for a perp walk.
Good night. Happy New Year.
And officially charged. Then transported by synchronised helicopters across the Empire State. The Statue of Liberty and New York's sparkling skyline, the last thing they laid eyes on, before arriving to a sea of officers surrounding the Metropolitan Detention Centre in Brooklyn.
On the night of January 3rd, the world did not react the way it normally reacts to the opening hours of a new war. The first alert spoke of American bombs falling on Venezuela, and the reflex was predictable. Another air campaign, another escalation ladder, another long sequence of warnings and counter-warnings. But the hours that followed did not resemble a conventional strike package meant to punish, deter, or degrade. The pattern of targets, the silence of Venezuelan command channels, and the sudden absence of the regime's public face pointed to something far rarer, a military action designed not to destroy a facility, but to remove a head of state as a living person intact from the sovereign center of his own security perimeter. What made the night extraordinary was not the noise of explosions, but the speed of the narrative collapse inside Caracas. In most crises, regimes buy time with ambiguity. They deny, they stall, they flood the information space with partial truths. Here, the window was measured in minutes, not days. A single operational concept was visible through the chaos. Seize the decision maker, sever the chain of loyalty, and let the rest of the system discover too late that it has been decapitated. The difference between striking a palace and extracting the leader from it is the difference between theater and surgery. A building can be rebuilt. A leadership myth, once physically carried away, rarely regenerates in the same form.
Major escalation. Donald Trump says the United States has carried out a large-scale strike in Venezuela, and the US has captured the country's president, Nicolás Maduro.
Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II. It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolás Maduro to justice. This was one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence. All Venezuelan military capacities were rendered powerless as the men and women of our military, working with U.S. law enforcement, successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night. It was dark and it was deadly, but captured along with his wife, Celia Flores, both of whom now face American justice. Maduro and Flores have been indicted in the Southern District of New York for their campaign of deadly narco-terrorism against the United States and its citizens.
The operation, described as a special military action, unfolded as a layered instrument rather than a single blow. Air power did not act as the main actor, but as the lock on the door, sealing the skies so that ground teams could move as if time itself had been paused. The concept implied deep insertion into the heart of Caracas, roughly 200 kilometers from the point of offshore launch, using heavy lift and assault helicopters typically reserved for missions where surprise is the primary armor. The claim that an extraction force included law enforcement alongside elite military personnel signaled the intended end state. Not a battlefield outcome, but custody, evidence, transport, and a controlled narrative of arrest rather than conquest.
You know, Donald Trump 2.0 is going completely unplugged in ways we've never thought. And after a lot of pressure being put on Venezuela and even Maduro, indicating he's ready for talks, the United States just went to the end and just went and got him. So the big question is not what they did yesterday or if he's going to go into the court system of the U.S. The question is what happens to Venezuela on day 2 to day 22, because what happens after a regime change, you can't control it. And we have got lots of history between Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and the other countries going to be in question are going to be what's Colombia going to be thinking about next, and the other countries in South America.
The air umbrella was not decorative. It was the difference between a raid and a suicide run. Fighters and strike aircraft, backed by electronic warfare and airborne surveillance, are designed to turn a city-sized battle space into a corridor of permission for a few helicopters and a few teams on the ground. In this telling, F-22 aircraft guarded the upper layer, while F-35 and F-18 platforms delivered precision effects meant to blind, shock, and paralyze. Smart munitions like Stormbreaker-class weapons are built for moving targets and complex urban geometry, where the goal is selective paralysis, not wide-area devastation. The logic was clear. Balance the nodes that could coordinate resistance, and the palace becomes a room, not a fortress. Then came the element that transforms shock into humiliation.
Taken from his slumber, the extraordinary mission to capture and remove him was conducted under the cloak of darkness.
This operation, known as Operation Absolute Resolve, was discreet, precise, and conducted for a single purpose: to get an interdiction force into downtown Caracas.
US helicopters arriving at Maduro's compound at 2:01 a.m.
The mission goal was framed as capturing the president and his wife alive. That single detail reorders the entire psychological map. A leader can survive an airstrike by hiding, dispersing, or relocating. A leader can claim resilience if the palace walls still stand. But a leader cannot easily claim resilience if he is physically removed from his bedroom by foreign operators who leave no time for speeches, negotiations, or choreographed defiance.
Frente a este ataque ruin y cobarde que amenaza la paz y estabilidad de la región, elevamos la más contundente denuncia ante la comunidad internacional y todos los organismos multilaterales para que se condene al gobierno norteamericano por la flagrante violación de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y del derecho internacional.
Do you envision the U.S. military having a presence in Venezuela as the U.S. runs that
Well,
country?
no, we're going to have a presence in Venezuela as it pertains to oil, because we have to have, we're sending our expertise in. So you may need something, not very much. But no, we're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground. And that wealth is going to the people of Venezuela and people from outside of Venezuela that used to be in Venezuela. And it goes also to the United States of America in the form of reimbursement for the damages caused us by that country.
Y desde aquí, desde este hermoso lugar, llamo a la calma a nuestro pueblo. Confíen en el liderazgo, confíen en la dirigencia del alto mando político, militar, para la situación que estamos atravesando. Mucha calma, que nadie caiga en el desespero, que nadie caiga en facilitarle las cosas al enemigo invasor. Y más allá de uno de nosotros o de otro o cualquiera de nosotros, aquí hay un pueblo que está organizado, un pueblo que sabe lo que tiene que hacer. Esperamos que el mundo se pronuncie sobre este ataque. O van a, ustedes de las organizaciones mundiales, los organismos mundiales, van a hacer pública su complicidad ante el ataque invasor.
The reported center of gravity offshore was a carrier-capable platform positioned roughly 200 kilometers from the coast, described as the operational heart of a mission labeled with a decisive code name. It also implies rehearsed coordination, because an operation that demands zero casualties is not the product of improvisation. It is the product of mapping, signals collection, timing windows, and an understanding of how a regime's guards react when their screens go dark and their radios become noise. Around the palace, simultaneous strikes were described against places that function as loyalty reservoirs, bases, hardened sites, and criminal networks that could generate armed response. The intent would be to cut the regime's reflexes before they can move. Air defenses, particularly Russian-made systems and Chinese-supplied sensors, were depicted as silent at the moment that mattered most. That silence is the most dangerous clue in the entire story, because it suggests not merely surprise, but either technological suppression or human refusal. If the systems were blinded, it demonstrates a capability gap that echoes far beyond Venezuela. If the systems were deliberately withheld, it suggests that the regime's protective shell was hollowed out from within at the decisive second. By the time the narrative reached the question of where the captured leader was being held, the operation had already shifted from military spectacle to intelligence earthquake. A head of state in custody is not only a symbol, he is a map of networks, financial channels, covert logistics, and the identities of intermediaries who normally remain unnamed. That is why Moscow and Beijing would feel pressure even without firing a shot. The removal of an ally is painful. The possibility that the ally becomes a knowledge source is catastrophic. In that sense, the raid is not only about Venezuela. It is about pulling a thread that could tighten around the broader architecture of influence that Russia and China have tried to build across the hemisphere. The calm tone of Washington's public messaging contrasted sharply with the magnitude of what had just occurred. When a state announces that it has conducted a large-scale operation and extracted a foreign head of state, the words themselves become a signal. They imply confidence not only in execution, but in the strategic aftermath. This was not framed as an accident, an escalation gone wrong, or a temporary measure. It was presented as a completed action, already folded into a broader doctrine. The implication was unsettling for observers who had grown accustomed to proxy conflicts and gradual pressure. The message was that the era of indirect regime erosion had been replaced by decisive intervention when conditions aligned. Inside Venezuela, the vacuum formed immediately. Statements from remaining officials sounded performative, detached from reality, as if issued by a system still pretending its center existed. The defense minister's declarations of resistance echoed without an audience, because authority in such regimes is vertical, not institutional. When the apex disappears, the lower tiers do not automatically inherit legitimacy. The population was left staring at an impossible contrast. Leaders who had promised permanence were suddenly absent, removed in the span of a single morning. This kind of shock does not inspire uprising or loyalty right away. It produces paralysis, the most dangerous condition for any authoritarian structure. The timing of the operation added another layer of humiliation, particularly for Beijing. Chinese officials had been present in Caracas, overseeing investments that totaled tens of billions of dollars tied to energy, infrastructure, and political alignment. The fact that the extraction began only hours after that delegation departed cannot be dismissed as coincidence. It communicated a cold precision, awareness of schedules, awareness of optics, and a willingness to let partners watch from afar as their assurances evaporated. For China, which prides itself on long-term planning and face-saving diplomacy, the image was devastating. Investments meant to secure influence became evidence of exposure. The question that immediately followed was why neither Russia nor China responded in any visible military way. Their initial reactions were confined to statements of condemnation, language that carried no operational weight. This silence invited speculation not about weakness alone, but about bargains. One scenario suggests that Venezuela was quietly traded on a larger board, exchanged for concessions elsewhere, possibly in Eastern Europe or in the slow recalibration of sanctions regimes. Another scenario points to exhaustion. Russia, after years of attritional warfare and dependence on external suppliers for ammunition, simply lacks the capacity to project power across an ocean. China, meanwhile, remains consumed by its own priorities in the Pacific, unwilling to test American resolve in a theater it cannot dominate. The contrast between the speed of this operation and the prolonged failures of other so-called special military campaigns was impossible to ignore. A regime change achieved in less than an hour, with no prolonged bombardment and no occupation force, stood in stark opposition to wars that had dragged on for years without achieving stated goals. Prestige in military affairs is not built on rhetoric, but on outcomes. For Moscow, the implication was corrosive. An ally was removed without a fight, under the shadow of systems that were supposed to guarantee protection. The credibility of Russian security promises suffered a wound that no press conference could heal. Attention then turned to the most uncomfortable mystery: the silence of the air defense network over Caracas. This network had been presented as one of the densest outside major powers, layered with long-range interceptors and modern radar systems. Yet during the operation, no missile launches were recorded, no defensive engagements observed. Two explanations dominated expert circles. The first was technological suppression, a demonstration that American stealth, cyber, and electronic warfare capabilities could render foreign systems inert at the critical moment. The second was betrayal. Senior officers, calculating survival rather than loyalty, may have chosen to stand down, effectively delivering their leader to his fate. Both explanations lead to the same conclusion: reliance on external hardware or internal fear cannot substitute for genuine cohesion. Reports of foreign mercenaries and advisors added weight to the betrayal hypothesis. Russian contractors and Chinese military personnel had been stationed in the capital, tasked with regime protection. Yet when the operation unfolded, these elements did not engage. Accounts suggested rapid disappearance, blending into civilian crowds, or retreating to prearranged safe houses. Mercenary logic is brutal and simple. Loyalty extends only as far as the probability of survival. When the probability collapses, contracts become meaningless. Their inaction reinforced the impression that once American forces committed, the psychological battle was already over. Beyond Caracas, the shock rippled outward. In neighboring capitals, especially those governed by leaders aligned with anti-American blocs, the operation was read not as an isolated incident, but as a precedent. Borders hardened, security forces were quietly repositioned, and rhetoric softened overnight. The unspoken questions circulated through presidential palaces and defense ministries alike. If it happened there, could it happen here? The fear was not of invasion, but of sudden, targeted removal. Helicopters do not need permission once deterrence fails. For Latin America as a whole, the event marked a brutal reassertion of hierarchy. The notion that the hemisphere had drifted into a multipolar buffer zone was shattered. The operation redefined the region as a space where ambiguity had ended. Compliance, alignment, or vulnerability became the new categories. This was not a message delivered through treaties or summits, but through rotor blades and sealed skies. The effect was immediate, not because of violence, but because of clarity. The unease was not confined to the Western Hemisphere. In distant capitals ruled by similarly insulated leaders, the news landed like a private warning. The capture of a president inside his most protected compound sent a message that alliances, distance, and even nuclear posturing do not guarantee personal immunity. The psychological shield that dictators rely on, the belief that power structures will always absorb shocks, was punctured. Once punctured, it cannot be restored by force alone. For countries that had tried to balance relations between rival blocs, the operation was a cold recalibration. The idea of maintaining profitable ties with authoritarian powers while enjoying access to Western markets suddenly looked untenable. Gray zones began to disappear. The use of hard power to eliminate ambiguity signaled that future alignments would demand clarity. The cost of hedging had risen overnight, and the price would be paid not in statements, but in vulnerability. The financial aftershocks of the operation began forming long before any official policy announcements were made. Markets do not wait for confirmation when structural signals are this clear. Venezuela's position as the holder of the world's largest proven oil reserves had been a frozen variable for years, locked behind sanctions, mismanagement, and geopolitical shielding. Overnight, that variable shifted status. Traders, energy ministries, and sovereign planners began recalculating scenarios in which millions of barrels that had been effectively dormant could return to circulation under a radically different political alignment. The importance of this shift cannot be overstated because oil is not just a commodity, it is the oxygen of several national budgets. For Russia, this represented a strategic nightmare, unfolding in slow motion. Its economic structure remains heavily dependent on sustained high-energy prices to finance both domestic stability and external military commitments. Every sustained drop in global oil prices translates into billions of dollars erased from fiscal projections, weakening the state's ability to subsidize war, maintain social control, and project confidence. The mere possibility that Washington could influence Venezuelan production levels introduced a new lever, one capable of compressing Russian revenue without firing a single shot on European soil. The implications extended beyond Russia's direct exports. Discounted energy sales to partners in Asia had become a lifeline, allowing Moscow to maintain volume even as margins shrank. If global supply expands significantly, the attractiveness of those discounts erodes. Buyers gain leverage, demand deeper price cuts, and diversify sources. In such an environment, energy ceases to be a geopolitical weapon and becomes a liability. The regime in Moscow has long relied on the threat of scarcity. An abundance controlled by its rival flips that equation entirely. Saudi Arabia and the broader producer alliance faced their own recalculations. Production quotas are negotiated in a delicate balance between price stability and market share. A sudden re-entry of Venezuelan supply under American influence would force uncomfortable choices. Cut output to prop up prices and concede share, or maintain output and accept lower revenues. Either path introduces friction into existing arrangements. The significance lies not in immediate decisions, but in the erosion of predictability. Energy geopolitics thrives on predictability. This operation injected volatility by design. Yet the deepest strategic damage was not felt in Moscow, but in Beijing. For China, Venezuela was never merely an energy supplier. It was a keystone in a broader plan to extend influence into the Western Hemisphere, establishing logistical, political, and financial footholds that could complicate American dominance close to home. Years of investment had been framed as patient groundwork for a future in which global trade routes and political alignments would gradually tilt. That future collapsed in a single night, not through economic competition, but through kinetic interruption. Projects once marketed as transformative now appeared stranded. Ambitious canal plans intended to bypass established choke points lost their political anchor. Port developments designed to host dual-use infrastructure became liabilities instead of assets. Without a friendly regime willing to absorb risk and shield operations, these investments lost strategic value. Cranes, terminals, and agreements do not generate power on their own. They require a protective environment. The removal of that environment exposed the fragility of China's southern expansion. The loss reverberated even into Arctic ambitions. Chinese planners had envisioned Venezuelan resources feeding into alternative northern routes, complementing partnerships designed to challenge existing maritime orders. Energy supply is the spine of such visions. Without secure sources, routes are theoretical. The sudden severing of this supply chain did more than disrupt a project. It invalidated an entire set of assumptions about reach and resilience. Beijing's claim to global logistical versatility suffered a blow that no white paper could obscure. In the Pacific, the consequences became sharper still. Latin America had functioned as a distraction zone, a place where American attention and resources could be diluted. The logic was simple: pressure the periphery to loosen the core. By resolving the Venezuelan challenge decisively, Washington inverted that logic. Resources could now be reallocated with confidence, naval focus sharpened, and strategic ambiguity reduced. For planners in Beijing, considering timelines and thresholds, the message was chilling. Delay had not bought safety. It had invited demonstration. This demonstration carried implications for Taiwan that went beyond rhetoric. The operation showcased an ability to integrate intelligence, stealth, logistics, and political timing into a single decisive act. It was not a rehearsal for invasion, but a proof of concept for access. The lesson was not that every scenario is identical, but that assumptions about American hesitation were outdated. Strategic patience, long celebrated as a virtue, suddenly looked like exposure. Across the developing world, security guarantees issued by Russia and China began to look conditional at best. Alliances are tested not in declarations, but in moments of crisis. The removal of a protected ally without effective response signaled limits. Leaders who had aligned themselves with the Eastern Bloc in exchange for promises of protection began reassessing the value of those promises. Credibility, once lost, demands years to rebuild. In geopolitics, time is a luxury rarely granted. Within Venezuela itself, the collapse of the regime's protective mythology created an unstable equilibrium. Power structures built on fear depend on the perception of inevitability. When that perception breaks, loyalty becomes transactional and fleeting. Elites hedge, security services hesitate, and the population waits. This waiting is not passive. It is charged with expectation and anxiety, conditions that can be shaped by whoever moves next. Control does not evaporate instantly, but it becomes contestable, which is often enough. The broader message of the operation was not one of conquest, but of reach. It demonstrated that geography, alliances, and advanced hardware do not automatically translate into immunity. It reframed deterrence from a static concept into a dynamic one, where timing and intelligence outweigh mass. This reframing unsettled established doctrines on both sides of the global divide because it challenged the comfort of gradual escalation models. The cumulative effect of these shifts was a reordering of expectations rather than an immediate realignment of borders. The operation demonstrated that power in the current era is measured less by territorial control and more by the ability to impose decisive outcomes without prolonged exposure. For years, global actors had adjusted to a rhythm of slow pressure, sanctions, and proxy engagements that allowed regimes time to adapt and audiences time to forget. That rhythm was interrupted. The message embedded in the Venezuelan operation was that when conditions converge, action can be swift, asymmetric, and final, leaving no space for prolonged narrative management. For Russia, the strategic consequences extended beyond economics and prestige. The loss of a Caribbean ally reduced its global depth, compressing its strategic horizon closer to its borders. Influence that once stretched across oceans now appeared brittle, dependent on circumstances Moscow could not control. This contraction matters because great power status is sustained as much by perceived reach as by actual capability.